Welcome to the Airport Wild Podcast. I'm Cody Bashuska, and tonight I'm joined with Dr. Jay Tischendorf and Bradley Lewis. This episode, we're going to be talking about zoonotic diseases and some of the precautions we should take when dealing with it, how we can recognize them, and the general history and overview of some of the potential exposures that we might have as airport biologists or airport ops staff. To get started, Jay, would you go ahead and just tell me a little bit about your background and maybe how you became interested in zoonotic diseases?
Yeah. Hey, Cody, fantastic to be here tonight. Thank you for the invitation. It's a real treat to spend some time with you. It's always too infrequent. And Brad, really great to meet you as well. So thanks for taking time to join in. But yeah, I always get pretty excited to talk about this topic. I just think it's really fascinating. I'm both a veterinarian and a wildlife biologist. Started out as a wildlife biologist and then got into veterinary medicine. And I've worked in vet med as general practice with pets. I also do some wildlife work on the side and as a veterinarian, and I continue to work as a wildlife biologist too. So really kind of have melded or merged all of these different careers. For me, as I sort of said earlier, infectious disease has always just been really a fascination of mine. And I can't really pinpoint exactly why. I do know that infectious disease has sort of been a part of my life. My father, my biological father, actually died acutely of fulminant hepatitis when I was just a child, a very young baby. In fact, he and I never met. He was down doing Latin American historical research for Duke University, where he was a young professor in the early 1960s when I was born. And he very acutely, very quickly succumbed to a raging hepatitis infection. And as I said, I never met him, but it kind of started my life off with this theme of infectious disease. And I remember growing up and spending time with my grandparents who had traveled quite a bit overseas as academics. They had taught college level and other classes around the world and had spent time in places like Egypt and Turkey and I believe Africa. But I remember them sharing with my brother and I one time a newspaper article, and this was probably in the late 60s or early 70s. And it was a wild case, a natural case of smallpox in, I think it was Ethiopia. And they said, this is one of the last cases of this disease that we'll ever see. And I remember just being fascinated by that. And lo and behold, as it turns out, smallpox is one of two and only two infectious diseases of the many that can infect humans. Well, it's one of only two infectious diseases that have been so-called eradicated on planet Earth. That smallpox being a human disease, and the other is a animal disease of hoofstock called rinderpest. But yeah, just being fascinated with that. And I remember as a Boy Scout going out to, my dad had served in the South Pacific in World War II. And, would tell stories of people with malaria and elephantiasis, a horrific disfiguring disease, and other things that they were concerned about as sailors in the Navy. And then I remember as a Boy Scout going out to Philmont Scout Ranch in New Mexico, and one of the first things we heard coming off our bus after a long drive from the Denver airport down to New Mexico was to be real careful with rodents, so ground squirrels and prairie dogs and things, because a ranch hand at a nearby ranch had died of plague. And this was in 1976. And that just really kind of captured my interest because I'd learned about plague as a kid, right? The Black Death and just how horrific that was, and kind of how, grotesquely fascinating it was that all these people died of this, infectious disease transmitted by fleas. At that same time, actually, AIDS was appearing, HIV was appearing on the scene. In the mid-late 70s, as was Legionnaire's disease. That same summer of 1976 in Philadelphia, there was an outbreak of this respiratory illness that caused multiple fatalities in a group of American Legion, old military veterans who had gathered in Philadelphia for a convention and were dying inexplicably, quite acutely, of this mysterious disease. And that just captivated me. And that became known as Legionnaire's disease. It's a bacterial infection. It came from contaminated water in the AC system that these folks were inhaling. And it was just, really, again, the mystery of what's this, the mystery killer, right? Just captivating for me. And I don't know, I guess maybe other people get bored by it, but I thought it was pretty amazing. And then another example is in the early 90s. I was working for the BLM doing Mexican spotted owl research in Colorado and southern Colorado, kind of that Four Corners area. And that same summer, the so-called Four Corners flu emerged. What we then discovered as a medical scientific community was a hantavirus that had not really previously been known from that area. It was also called the virus sin nombre, the virus without name, which just has kind of a fascinating, enigmatic sound to it, right? I mean, that just to me is like, oh my gosh, some of the names of some of these diseases are really amazing, and maybe later on we'll touch on a few of those. But I remember at the time having been working with these Mexican spotted owls and handling their pellets and the owls themselves, and getting into wood rat nests and things in the cliffs as we're looking for owls and things. Just kind of thinking, some of this maybe isn't the healthiest thing to be doing, to be handling these things and going through pellets without gloves and face mask and inhaling all this dust that comes out of them when they're dried. And then lo and behold, this Four Corners flu, hantavirus, transmitted by rodents in their feces and urine, and secretions and probably bites as well, appears on the scene, and it just reinforced my concerns. Had a pretty good friend who was a wildlife biologist, worked for the National Park Service. He and I met in the early 2000s. I was helping out the National Park Service in the Santa Monica Mountains National recreation area, just right outside Los Angeles, doing some mountain lion and bobcat work for them as a wildlife veterinarian. And I met this biologist named Eric York, and we got to be friends. Eric subsequently died of plague doing a necropsy of a dead mountain lion that he had radio-collared and radio-tracked, and taken out of the park when it died back to his garage and done a kind of a field necropsy in his garage, not knowing that animal had died of plague, and he contracted plague. Yersinia pestis is the bacteria. And in very short order, developed, illness, flu-like symptoms, no doubt, and fever and aches and other things. But little did he know he was developing a, systemic body-wide infection with plague, and he died very, very suddenly. And CDC was called in because of the mysterious nature of his death, and it was figured out that it tied back to that mountain lion. So anyway, infectious disease has really sort of been a current, a theme throughout my life. And those are just a handful of the stories I could share. But both as a biologist and a veterinarian, I've been fascinated by the diseases that wildlife and animals, domestic animals, can transmit to people, especially. I mean, that's a subset of infectious diseases. We call those zoonotic diseases. And those, by definition, just so everybody's on the same page, are basically diseases, infectious diseases shared between or transmitted between animals and people. And some folks will even make that a little more specific and use another term for diseases that humans might more typically transmit to animals. And there are some, and they may give that a different term, but I basically lump those into zoonotic diseases as well. So any infectious disease shared between humans and animals, or animals and people, is a zoonotic disease. And just a side note, one of the things that's also fascinating about zoonotic diseases is there's this new emerging area of medicine called One Health. And the foundation of One Health is this premise, that human health, animal health, and environmental health are all inextricably entwined. And I like to say that zoonotic diseases really are a poster child for that philosophy or that concept, because you've got these diseases coming from animals in the wild, getting transmitted to humans in an environment that we both share or may have in common. And so, you take those three components: human health, environmental health, and animal health, and they all do come together. And along with that, as climate is changing, and we can debate, we don't have to, but we could debate whether or not it's human related. But as climate is changing, and I argue that it is getting warmer, we don't need to go into the weeds on what are the causes of that, but clearly there are some warming trends that seem fairly dramatic and out of the norm. Those are also increasing the risk of infectious disease, and perhaps even speeding up the evolution of infectious diseases or the emergence of them. But in any case, that's another aspect of the environment. When you look at environmental health, if we think of global warming as an environmental health issue, then again, you've got that link between the environment, human health, and animal health. So yeah, probably bored everybody to death by now. But anyway, long answer to your short question, Cody. That's who I am, and that's why I just think infectious disease is really fascinating. The last thing I'll say on that is, many of these diseases have some really, really amazing, astounding, intricate, almost unbelievable life histories in terms of how they have to propagate themselves, and the different hosts that they may require to actually develop, say, as a parasitic type infectious disease, or in some cases even viruses that they have to, if we think about rabies, that they have to go through these different host animals, reservoir species, to actually find a victim, so to speak, and propagate themselves. So really, really complex, fascinating, and unfortunately not always easily diagnosed or easily treated. So there's a lot to be said for prevention, which I guess is a nice segue to this conversation tonight that we're having, or today that we're having.
Yeah, that was very detailed, Jay, and you answered a few of the questions that I had marked down already in your intro. But so I guess what I'd like to do is talk about some of the maybe five most common, or a few of the most common diseases that people might be exposed to. And I really, you brought up a good point about the life cycle and the different, like, Lyme's, how it has to go through a few different hosts. And sometimes people get involved in that life cycle.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then, I know one big topic in New York is rabies. We actually,
Sure.
we just had all winter we've been getting positive cases reported to the health department in my town. And I know a lot about rabies and the prevention of it and the dangers of it, but I don't really know the life stages or the life cycle of that. So I guess if you could pick maybe the five most likely or the most common ones that people should be aware of.
Okay.
Would
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great, Cody. Thank you. I'm bad at math, so I might come up short, or maybe we'll even throw in a bonus disease or something for kicks and giggles.
Just a number to throw out there. So, however,
Yeah.
what do you, you're the professional, you have how many years of experience in this? So what do you think are the ones that we should be looking at tonight?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and I've certainly got some big ones, diseases that I'm thinking of. I'll say here too that there's number one, there's probably somewhere north of 1,000 infectious diseases that can affect or infect humans, and 60% of those are considered zoonotic. So the majority of infectious diseases that humans need to be worried about, in fact, are zoonotic. And what's also fascinating and perhaps alarming is that 75% of newly emerging infectious diseases or newly discovered infectious diseases are zoonotic. So it does seem that the playing field is changing. And, some of the audience members may be sort of scratching their head saying, well, how often is one of these darn, new diseases showing up? It just seems kind of far-fetched, but au contraire, just like, skeptics in terms of wildlife discoveries, we know everything that's on Earth. I just saw a headline as I was getting ready to come into the podcast here about a new snake being discovered in China. And not too long ago, I read about a guy who's discovered 30 new species. He's shooting for 100, but he's discovered 30 so far, new species down in Ecuador and the rainforest. And so just as we discover new species of animals and birds and reptiles and everything else pretty regularly, even in this so-called modern era, it's pretty consistent that we're discovering, collectively, medicine and science are discovering new infectious diseases every year or so. And oftentimes those are tick-borne diseases. So that's one area I do want to talk about. And Cody, you had mentioned Lyme disease. That's a good one. And that touches on a couple topics. One is that by some definitions, Lyme disease is not zoonotic. In my definition, it is, because that's an infectious disease that both humans and animals, for instance, even domestic dogs, probably cats too, can get Lyme disease. It's not transmitted directly from the animal to people. And for many, that's their definition of zoonotic diseases. There has to, like rabies, transmitted through the bite of or the scratch of an infected animal. Lyme disease is not transmitted directly from the animal to the human, but humans and animals share basically the same disease, and it is transmitted to either of those groups by the same tick, the so-called deer tick or black-legged tick, Ixodes scapularis. And in my definition of wildlife, I would consider a tick to be wildlife anyway. So, we're kind of slicing and dicing things. I also want to mention that, we talked about the numbers of diseases, just in terms of zoonotic diseases alone. And sometimes it's kind of fun to go through the alphabet, but literally they run from A to Z, from anthrax to Zika, and everything in between, including, somebody will say, well, Dr. J, there's no Q disease. Well, actually there is Q fever. And so that's a bacterial disease, highly, highly infectious. But anyway, we could literally run through the alphabet from anthrax to Zika and come up with a zoonotic disease or more, one or more for every letter in the alphabet. So fun and games with infections, right? Let's talk, since you asked about 5, let's talk about rabies as a good place to start, because that is really kind of the poster child for zoonotic diseases. Rabies is a viral disease. It's transmitted by a virus, and it's been known to humanity as a disease for, tens of thousands of years, going back to ancient cultures. We're aware of this fatal ailment that people would get when they were exposed to animals that were acting bizarrely. Of course, it wasn't until more what we would call the era of modern medicine and science that viruses were actually discovered, and rabies virus was elucidated or identified and discovered to be the cause of this infectious disease. But it has been known to mankind, the scourge of mankind, for years. Thankfully, today, there is a vaccine, thanks to the work going back 100 years or so to Louis Pasteur, who developed a vaccine for rabies. So there is some protection we can have from this disease. Rabies is found more or less globally, but there are continents such as Australia and like, for instance, the United Kingdom, not a continent, but a country, Hawaii, an island that doesn't have rabies on it. And those jurisdictions tend to work really, really hard to keep rabies out. But it, in essence, is a global zoonotic disease. And experts will say roughly about every 10 minutes on planet Earth, somebody dies of rabies, even today. And if you do the math, it's about 50 to 75,000 people a year sadly, mostly kids in third world countries dying from rabies. Here in North America, which is, I think, the focus for us today, the main species that are transmitting rabies are what I call the BaRFS. So bats, raccoons, foxes, and skunks. And they're pretty much found all around the continent. If you go to Puerto Rico, mongooses are also implicated in transmitting rabies. But here in continental U.S., it's the bats, raccoons, foxes, and skunks. And not to say that other species can't or won't get rabies. It can infect any warm-blooded mammal, basically. But those are the main vectors transmitting the disease. So the 1 or 2 or 3 cases, human cases of rabies each year, and that's the number each year today, it's about 1 to 3 cases annually, humans that are infected with rabies, and they all tend to be fatal. It's considered, for all intents and purposes, 100% fatal. Those individuals typically got rabies from one of those species, bats, raccoons, foxes, or skunks. It sort of depends where you're at on the continent, which of those particular species is the most common carrier of rabies or reservoir for rabies in your area. Some areas of the country, it's more skunks, some it's more raccoons. Bats are basically everywhere as potential reservoirs. A couple fascinating things about rabies. I think most people sort of have a sense of it. If you haven't watched Old Yeller in the last decade, rent the movie and watch it. It's a great reminder of how horrible that disease is, particularly before we had vaccinations for animals to help protect them against it. But it is a virus, and that virus, we can be infected with it, but it isn't until it gets to our central nervous system that it causes what we consider to be the classic signs of the disease, rabies. And therein is one of the secrets and blessings, I guess, if you will, about this terrible, fatal, 100% fatal disease, is that between that time of infection, or what some people would call exposure, say from the bite of a rabid animal, or even potentially the scratch of a bat that might be crawling around on you in your room at night that you don't know about. It may have rabies virus on its claws that it got from its own saliva, which is where the rabies virus is produced or secreted from the animal mostly. But from that time of that infection to the time that virus actually gets to your central nervous system, and specifically the brain, there is a lag period, and we call that the incubation period. And what's happening there is the virus finds a peripheral nerve, and it basically moves up that nerve to the spinal cord, and then up the spinal cord to the brain. And once it gets to the brain, those official symptoms and signs of rabies kick in. And that's where then we've got what we would call a rabid animal or a rabid person. And that's, in essence, 100% fatal. We'll talk about maybe a little exception to that, but I always tell people don't bank on being that exception, okay? But in that incubation period, that lag period between the time of infection and the actual onset of the disease, there is that window of opportunity where we can not necessarily treat the person or even the animal for rabies, but get them vaccinated if they're not already vaccinated, in hopes that their own immune system, because of the benefit of the vaccine against rabies, is able to fight the disease off and prevent them from getting the signs and symptoms that are 100% fatal of rabies. The other thing that goes with that so-called, treatment, which really is more prevention after the fact, is the injection of immunoglobulin. So hyperglobulin, that's basically massive amounts of anti-rabies antibodies that are injected at the site of the infection, the bite wound or the scratch. And so that has to be done very soon after the actual incident happened. So time is always of the essence with rabies. But that serum comes from horses that are basically inoculated with minuscule microscopic amounts of rabies virus and are able to fight it off. And then in doing so, their body develops immunoglobulins or antibodies against the virus. that can be purified and used as an injection in, we typically just do this in humans, but human victims of rabies infection. So all of this is a gamble because there's no 100% guarantee that any of these things are going to work. The hyperglobulin injections may not work. The idea is that those are going to kill the virus. The antibodies will kill the rabies virus before it has a chance to start spreading up into peripheral nerves and up into the spinal cord and the brain. And nor is there a 100% guarantee that the vaccine will work to get that individual immunized before the virus gets to their brain. And if the bite or scratch occurs in the face or close to the head, that incubation period for the virus is far less, presumably, than it would be if you're bitten on the big toe or your calf or a finger, where then that virus has a long way to go up the peripheral nerves to get your brain. So bottom line here is knowing that any basically mammal can carry rabies and potentially transmit it, and knowing that it's 100% fatal. My recommendation, everybody, whether they work with domestic animals and as veterinarians or animal control people or wildlife biologists working with wildlife, is ensure that we aren't getting bitten by anything, okay, and or scratched. Easier said than done. And so the other recommendation I strongly urge anybody that chooses to work with animals, that chooses that working with animals is going to be their lifelong profession, career, is save up and just get yourself vaccinated against rabies. I'll sleep better at night. You'll sleep better at night. You're one step ahead if you do have that bite or scratch that seems abnormal. If I'm a black bear or a grizzly bear and I attack somebody because I'm defending a kill or my cubs, that's understandable in terms of the behavior. That would not strike me as a rabid bear, nothing unusual about that. But if I'm a fox out in the middle of the daylight and I'm stumbling around and I've got saliva coming out of my mouth and I'm acting aberrantly and charging at people, or falling over and getting up and wobbling and then, attacking things, biting at the air, whatever, that's very aberrant behavior. And so contact with that animal would be considered really suspicious and highly likely to be a risk for rabies infection or exposure. So, but again, I think getting vaccinated, especially if you're in animal control, veterinary work, wildlife biology, and regularly handling animals, regardless of the species, I just think it's an extra level of precaution that makes a lot of sense. We can, everybody has their sense about vaccines today. Unfortunately, we've entered into this anti-vaccine mindset for many people. But I do think it's a good protective measure. And cost-wise, if you're a military veteran, you could probably get the VA to do it for free. Otherwise, you're probably looking, it's typically about a 3 injection series to get the full course of the vaccine, 2 to 3 vaccines. Probably looking at about $500 to $1,000 or something. And I would call, if you're interested in that, I would call your public health department or look up online travel doctors. There are certain doctors that specialize in taking care of people who do a lot of overseas travel. And they typically have access to some of these more unusual vaccines or medications that might be needed for folks like that. So, but that's one disease. Again, it's both simple and complex. I should have mentioned that once that virus gets to the brain and those symptoms take place, what's happening is rabies causes this massive encephalitis or inflammation or infection of the brain and the tissue surrounding it. And so there's a ton of pain, swelling and pain that goes with that. There is, and then the virus is reproducing in the salivary glands of those victims. Okay. They don't want to swallow their saliva because it's so painful to swallow. Hence the term hydrophobia was a long time used to describe rabies. Fear of water. It's the fear of swallowing. And many of those victims also will have photophobia, which means they're sensitive to light. Light can cause pain. The sensation causes pain in their brain. and also aerophobia. So if you wave your hand, create a little breeze in front of these people, just that little stimulation, of the skin that causes is enough to cause them excruciating pain. So basically, yeah, they are in incredible pain and so on. And ultimately, rabies destroys they stop breathing eventually is what happens. Of course, with animals, we would euthanize them, and in people, we just have to watch them die on their own. But that's why the bite is so critical, because that's where the virus is theoretically in that saliva. It's where it's multiplying in the virus, or being the infectious version of the life stage of the virus there. I did mention there have been a couple survivors, and it's worth just talking about this because back, it was probably now about 20 or maybe even 30 years ago, a young girl named Jenna Giese picked up a bat in a church, and it was sick, and she was very compassionate. She wanted to try to help it. Well, little did she know it had rabies. And in short order, she came down with the signs and symptoms of rabies, which, of course, 100% fatal. The doctors, and this was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, they threw a Hail Mary pass. They asked the family if they could put young Jenna in a medically induced coma and try to blast her with antiviral drugs, probably the rabies vaccine, the hyperimmune globulin, whatever, and try to help her fight off the virus. And the parents acquiesced. They said, yes, you can do that. I mean, they had, the only other option is they're going to watch their daughter die. And so the medical team did that. And after a certain amount of time, they woke Jenna up from her medically induced coma, and the virus had been eradicated from her body. So she was considered the first human survivor of rabies. And since then, what's now called the Milwaukee Protocol has been used, hundreds of times. And unfortunately, only about 10 other people, maybe even less, have ever survived rabies using that Milwaukee Protocol. So that's why I tell people, there's some folks that know that there have been a few survivors, and they know a little bit about that protocol and the medically induced coma and so on. But I always caution them. I say, it rarely works, and you don't want to gamble on it working for you. So you're much better off preventing bites and then also having that preemptive rabies vaccine. Because if you are in a situation that's considered suspicious for rabies, the behavior of the animal was aberrant. It clearly wasn't just defending young or its nest site or den site or territory. It was acting bizarrely and totally inappropriately in terms of what we'd expect for that animal, that fox, that raccoon, whatever. Then even if you are pre-vaccinated, you're going to get you'll get booster vaccines and possibly the hyperglobulin injection, but you'll be that much further ahead right from the start because you already had some existing immunity in your body to help fight that virus off. So that gives you a leg up in terms of your chances of survival. So I'll just say, I guess, as a last point, and then ask if Cody and you and Brad have any questions. But those that are interested, you can actually find video of both animals and people on YouTube that have rabies. And sadly, the people, it's quite often children that have rabies. And there are some examples where you can see people trying to offer them water, and they're turning their heads away, just like, they can't even think about the idea of swallowing because it's so painful. But animals, including horses and other species, street dogs, and et cetera. So those that are interested, you can actually see some pretty, fascinating, sad, horrific, but compelling video of rabies on YouTube. So, yeah. What questions do you guys have?
I had a question. It comes up a lot in my wildlife trainings at airports, and people, some of my friends have asked as well. If you find a dead animal, like a raccoon, fox, bat even, either in your house or on your property, how long does the rabies virus last in that animal? Or how long is it thought to last?
Yeah. The general answer is theoretically, the rabies virus doesn't last long beyond body temperature of that animal. But, I always say, or I always try to say in these types of venues and discussions, I always give the benefit of the doubt to these things. Okay. They don't always read the textbook. And if it's 100 degrees out, which quite often it is anywhere in North America in the middle of July or August, then that's body temperature or higher for some species. So it wouldn't surprise me if that animal died of rabies or was carrying rabies, that it still could have living virus for an extended time. So always a really good idea, and not just because of rabies, but any of these other, A to Z zoonotic diseases that we could talk about, that you handle living and dead animals both with a lot of care and caution and respect for what they might be carrying, whether it's fleas or ticks that could get on us, or mites that could be carrying diseases, things that may be in their bloodstream or their urinary fluid or feces, or in their saliva. So just a good idea across the board to always think in terms of personal protective equipment, PPE, and really take it seriously. And, have the proper system and protocol for picking up a carcass, ideally wearing certainly gloves and, a garbage bag that perhaps you can invert over the carcass so you're not handling it directly, even with your gloves, face mask, eye protection to avoid splatter, blood, body fluids, urine, any of those things, saliva. Other diseases I'd be concerned about, and we can talk more specifically about these, but avian influenza, avian flu, leptospirosis, any of the diseases that fleas and ticks can transmit. Many of these animals are carrying fleas and ticks, and they're going to come off of that dead animal or even that living animal potentially onto us if we're handling it not careful. Huge number of diseases that those things can transmit as vectors. Hantavirus, with rodents potentially. So again, not just because of rabies, Brad, but you want to definitely give these pathogens, these microbes, these germs, these agents of disease a lot of respect, and assume the worst. Give them the benefit of the doubt. Don't think we know everything there is to know about them, because we certainly don't. And as I said, there's new diseases showing up every year or so anyway that we know very little about. So good idea to really take the personal protective equipment seriously. If in some cases, I would advocate Tyvek suit, head to toe with a hood, rubber boots, gloves, duct tape around the seams at the cuffs or the wrist cuffs or the ankle or the knee, around the rubber boots, and face mask, the whole 9 yards. It really kind of depends on the situation, but there are some times where I do recommend that level of personal protective equipment, depending on what the scenario is. Cody, any thoughts on that? And then we can talk about a couple more diseases if you like. I did mention a few that I think we should talk about.
I've been terrified of rabies since I was a little kid. I remember getting bit by a mouse when I was probably 5 or 6, and having nightmares about getting rabies. I think I must have probably just watched Old Yeller or something, because it was really fresh in my mind. So it's always been a caution. And as soon as I could get a rabies vaccination, I got rabies vaccinations.
Good for you.
And since have had occasion to get a booster because of potential exposure. For whatever reason, Central New York, where I live, we've had multiple cases of rabid skunks, raccoon. We just had a report that came out from our county health department today for a rabid raccoon, and about a month ago, a horse died on our road and it was tested.
Wow. Yeah. Jeez.
Definitely,
it's amazing
around. So I'm very cautious with it. Everyone that works in our company has to, before they can handle any mammals, have to have a rabies vaccination. It's something that I think anybody, I concur, is if you're working with wildlife on a regular basis, you should get that just for peace of mind. And it's not a horrible shot.
No.
correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's considered one of the most effective shots and long-term shots that there has ever been as far as its effectiveness and how long-term it's worked. It's just a good thing to have.
Yeah, I believe you are right. Certainly with animals, the rabies vaccines are considered highly, highly effective, even with a limited number of doses. And that's a legal requirement that the manufacturers, based on literally CFR level, so Code of Federal Regulations level guidelines from the federal government about vaccine manufacturing. And with the rabies vaccine, they have to be very, very potent and very well tested and have a long, potentially a very long duration of immunity that they provide. So, yeah, and not to say we don't want to keep those current in our animals, and usually it's a 1 or 3 year duration, and we've got to keep up with that legally. But yeah, those are typically really good vaccines, and I suspect on the human side as well. I know my own immunity on the human side from rabies vaccine that I had in veterinary medical school lasted upwards of 20 years and finally fell below what was considered a protective titer or level immunologically when I was tested at one point. And so I got a booster vaccine, and technically I should have my titer rechecked to make sure I went above that protective level with that booster. So that would be one of my homework assignments, is to do that.
Jay, I was going to actually bring that up because I had my first shot in 2003, or my first series of shots, and I checked my titer every year, just out of precaution. And then I had a potential exposure, so they gave me a booster shot. I guess it was about a year or two ago. So I haven't checked it since then. But even up until 20 years, it was good in me too. So, but that brings me to a point. What is titer? You mentioned that. Can you explain what that is and how people have that tested if they had a shot and wanted to check on that?
Yeah, and so titer is the term that's given to the antibody levels in our own bodies against a given disease. And at least with rabies, there's some standards that have been developed that are considered, you're either above that, you have a high enough titer, which is to say your level of antibodies is considered protective. If you were infected with the virus, your body would be able to very likely fight it off, versus being below, having too low of a titer, where you should get a booster rabies vaccine to try to increase your antibody production again. And those standards have been set. They're not 100%. And so, you have to take those with a bit of a grain of salt, so to speak, but at least it is a rough guideline. And certainly if somebody has been vaccinated against rabies and their titer is considered low at some point, if they really take their health seriously and they're still working with wildlife, then absolutely they should get a booster vaccine or more, depending on what their medical provider recommends, and get that titer rechecked to make sure that they are above the protective level again. But all that is antibody levels in our bloodstream. So yeah.
Before we move on to another infectious disease, I had a question about I wanted to get your thoughts on Virginia opossum being the only known non-vector species. Is that true, or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, possums, keep in mind, they're marsupial. And so, kind of a different critter. And I am not aware, again, I always give the benefit of the doubt to these pathogens and these diseases. Having said that, I am not aware of a possum ever being confirmed to have been infected or transmitted rabies. My understanding with possums, well, number one, they are marsupials, so they're kind of a critter of a different make and model. But it's my understanding that their body temperature is too low to be suitable for rabies. So I don't know, but I think possums are great animals. They certainly aren't. They don't appear in any of the, at least not high on any of the lists of the main culprits of rabies. I mentioned what I call the BaRFS, right? The bats, raccoons, foxes, and skunks, and mongooses also. But yeah, you don't see possums on there, and possums are pretty common. So yeah, I do think there is something to that story about them. But in essence, any warm-blooded mammal is a potential. I saw rabies. The one wild case I think I've ever seen was a groundhog or a woodchuck in Pennsylvania that was acting very, very strangely, and I'm pretty sure had rabies virus. But yeah. But guys, here's a couple of the diseases we could talk about. I'll just touch on avian influenza real quick, because almost without fail, it seems like over the last 20 years, any given day, there's some avian influenza outbreak or smoldering situation going on somewhere in the world. And we say influenza, the common name for that is flu, right? And so the problem with the influenzas is they're very, very common. They're all over the world. They tend to mutate very quickly and easily, and they can jump from species to species. So what may start out as a bird flu or avian influenza could fairly easily become a mammal flu, like, say, mutate to become a swine flu that really has a predilection to infect swine or potentially other mammals in general. And of course, humans are mammals. And so then we might fall into that. And that's exactly what happened, not quite 100 years ago to the day, but almost, with what I consider, certainly one of the greatest single cause events of human mortality ever on planet Earth. And that was the famed Spanish flu outbreak of roughly 1916 to 1918 or so. And within just a couple of years, that flu virus, which started out as a bird flu and mutated to a swine flu and then mutated to a human flu, literally rampaged around the planet from pole to pole, taking out about 10% of the known human population on Earth at that time, which was somewhere anywhere from probably close to 50 million people or something like that. And keep in mind, 100 years ago, we didn't have almost 8 billion people on Earth. It was closer to probably 2 billion. And that flu literally took out about 10%, 5 to 10% of the human population. Keep in mind, too, 100 years ago, folks, we didn't have, well, what didn't we have? I could ask you, we didn't have high-speed air travel, plane travel, car travel, train travel. And yet, within the short order of 2 years, that virus swept around the whole world. Can you imagine how fast that would happen today? I mean, literally, we're talking about the true zombie apocalypse if an influenza like that struck. And that's the one pathogen, the flus, the influenzas, that I tend to think keeps the experts up most late at night, is because these viruses, the flus, the influenzas, they can mutate very quickly. They can be highly virulent or highly infectious and cause a lot of illness, including fatalities, fairly easily. And they're really common, and so, people kind of poo-poo the idea of getting your annual flu vaccine. And they sort of, joke about how ineffective those vaccines are and blah, blah, blah. But, that might be the only thing standing between you and the next Spanish flu type outbreak. And so, and it, I always say it's not a question of if, it's a question of when it will happen again. So if we think about avian influenza, for that matter, even mammal influenza, pretty common. They circulate around the world almost continuously. And right now there is a bird flu outbreak going on. And in fact, it has been transmitted to some mammals. I know in Colorado, even in recent past, they've had black bears and mountain lions that have died of bird flu, this particular bird flu. So, if we're handling pigeons, ducks, any avian species potentially, we could possibly get exposed to this virus and maybe be that index case, that first case where it's decided it is going to mutate. And so, that type of close exposure that's not typical is oftentimes implicated in the emergence of these new diseases or the discovery of zoonotic diseases. So HIV, for instance, AIDS, very closely related to the simian immunodeficiency virus of apes. And presumably there was some close contact between non-human primates and humans, probably in Africa or somewhere, and that SIV virus presumably mutated and became infectious to humans as another primate. And we talk about, some of the, I said you don't have rabies in Australia, but you do have some similar viruses like Hendra, which emerged back in the early 90s. There was a case on a horse farm where a horse trainer and then a veterinarian, horses were dying, horse trainer died, veterinarian died, and this was traced back to a rabies-like virus called Hendra that was coming from flying foxes or fruit bats that were roosting in trees under which the horses had been feeding and grazing. And they'd been exposed to this Hendra virus, and it was infectious to humans. And so, but it was that kind of unusual close contact between the horses and the bats, and then the humans and the horses, that led to that being discovered and zoonotic. But that type of unusual close association, bushmeat, so down in, say, South America, where they're clearing jungle to make room for more agriculture to, feed the 8 billion mouths of humans on planet Earth, the people doing that clear cutting and jungle clearing oftentimes are sort of living hand to mouth themselves, shooting or killing whatever they see and eating it, probably not butchering it with very hygienic techniques. And, in many cases, those could be primates or flying foxes and fruit bats that carry all kinds of different germs themselves. And all of a sudden, overnight, those creatures that have never had any association with humans, or vice versa, are now having those associations. And so those viruses, those bacteria, those fungi can jump perhaps from species to species and mutate, or just decide that, hey, I can infect you just as easily as I can infect that bat or that primate. So here we go. And that can be the onset of some of these outbreaks. Ebola virus, similar type story, with zoonotic coming from probably primates, etc. So so I would be real careful. Again, that's just another reason to use good precautions in PPE if you're handling birds. Lots of birds can carry other things, other diseases too, but that's just one example of why I would be careful. There's a dead goose out on the runway. Don't just go grab it with your bare hands. I would bag that up. I'd have a mask and gloves and make sure I've got some way to keep my clothing clean and use proper protective equipment. Leptospirosis is another one I like to talk about. That's transmitted largely in the urine of infected animals. It's a bacterial disease, we call it lepto for short, but it's leptospirosis. Very commonly carried by coyotes, some of these same culprits we talked about with rabies, but coyotes, foxes, rats, rodents, very commonly carry leptospirosis. They secrete it into the environment when they urinate. It can live for a long time just in suspended animation, if you will, in puddles and moist soil, humid environment. And if we're getting exposed to that water where the bacteria is living, or directly from the urine of those animals, probably even the bites and the saliva, reproductive fluids, tissue fluids, blood, then potentially we're getting exposed. And that's that's the world's most widespread zoonotic disease. And the more we look for it, the more we find it. So I always assume that, every animal basically is carrying something that we don't want, whether it's rabies or lepto or Balis ascaris roundworms that raccoons carry, avian influenza. So again, I love animals. I love handling them, but I try to do it with a lot of respect and caution.
Jay, what are some of the signs of if a person's supposed to come in with lepto?
Cody, great question, and thank you, because that's kind of a loaded question, as it turns out. It's a great question because this is one of the problems with zoonotic diseases, and perhaps is why my friend Eric York is no longer with us, is because many of these diseases cause what we call non-specific signs. In the lexicon of veterinarians, we say ADR, ain't doing right. Doc, my dog ain't doing right. And that's oftentimes how we feel when we've got these infectious diseases, these zoonotic diseases. Just, I don't feel right, fever, achy, maybe loss of appetite, maybe some vomiting, diarrhea, maybe some what looks to be a rash, who knows, muscle aches, ADR, right? I just ain't doing right. And that's the problem because, that sounds a lot like the common cold or the flu, right? And so I always tell folks that work with animals, anytime you're not doing right, you're feeling sick, you really need to get checked out by a medical professional and absolutely let them know that you work with animals. Eric York actually went to a doctor with bubonic plague, but I'm not privy to that discussion. My guess is the doctor felt he had the 24-hour flu or a cold or Montezuma's revenge, bad meal, bad burrito, and sent Eric home, and he died. If he'd treated Eric with the proper antibiotic, because he heard Eric, and Eric said, and again, I don't know if Eric told him that, hey, I just necropsied a rancid dead mountain lion in my garage. Could that be a problem? I don't know if that conversation happened, but if it had, and the doctor said, well, yeah, that could be a real major problem, and I'm concerned about plague, here's an antibiotic that should help you, Eric might still be with us today. So the signs and symptoms, Cody, for instance, of lepto, again, ADR, ain't all right, fever, malaise, it tends to affect the kidneys and the liver, sometimes the lungs. So one could develop, kidney failure, liver failure in the advanced stages. If it's liver's involved, you're typically become icteric or jaundiced or yellow. Vomiting, possibly diarrhea, muscle aches and pain, systemic, as this infection starts to move through the bloodstream and take over the body, shutting down organs, massive pain. If it's not, the good news is it's easily treated with the right antibiotics. The bad news is if the diagnosis is not made quick enough, it does become what we call septicemic or systemic, infecting the whole body. And it becomes very difficult then to save those patients. But yeah, it's going to start out with flu-like symptoms, quite honestly. Mm-hmm. Fever, aches and pains. As I say, I don't mean to, beat the dead horse, but ADR just ain't doing right, whatever that looks like. And as I say, that's one of the problems with many of these zoonotic diseases is they don't have specific signs that a doctor or a medical professional can look to and say, I know exactly what you have. And many of these don't have a specific test either necessarily that one would routinely run. Say, I'm going to test you for lepto. A lot of times that would be a very special test. And that doctor or medical provider would really have to be on their game that day to think about doing that. So, yeah, they can be tricky. And some of these, even if we can identify the disease, diagnose it, we don't necessarily have good treatments. Rabies is a great example, right? We don't have a specific antiviral, anti-rabies drug we can give. Necessarily. Yeah. So, but so lepto is one, as I mentioned, rodents. So, if we're trapping rodents on the airfield as part of a wildlife hazard assessment or doing rodent control on an airfield after the fact to kind of help mitigate against raptors and foxes and raccoons and coyotes getting onto the airfield. handling those rodents, high risk of lepto. If we're trapping raccoons and foxes and skunks and coyotes on that airfield to relocate them or whatever we're going to do, high risk of lepto and rabies and Bayless ascaris, roundworm for the raccoons. So lots of different things go with all of this. And again, I always try to tell folks, don't get so wrapped around the axle about the individual diseases. Just think in terms of the big picture and how you protect yourself. And almost regardless of what the disease is, there's the three main routes of exposure that I think we need to be concerned about. And that's, putting things in our mouth that we shouldn't, inhaling things that we don't want to inhale, or getting bitten or inoculated or injected with something that we don't want. So that would be like puncture wounds, getting poked by, the old sort of classic tetanus, right? I stepped on a rusty nail and it had tetanus bacteria on it. Now I got tetanus, that kind of thing. So that would be like, an injection of sorts, right? An inoculation of sorts, similar to a bite wound. So those three routes of exposure for all of us that work with wildlife or domestic animals are really key to protect ourselves. So how do we do that? Well, we wear face masks. We wear eye shields to protect our mucous membranes of the eye, the conjunctiva. We wear gloves. We wash our hands. We wear, in some cases, full Tyvek bodysuits to prevent splash and all of that and keep our underclothing clean. But so regardless of what the disease is, well, those are going to be my big concerns, is protecting myself and all of you against those three routes of exposure. And that largely will protect us against most of the diseases we talk about, whether it's rabies or lepto or avian influenza or flea and tick-borne diseases. If those insects can't bite me or don't want to bite me, then I'm pretty well protected against anything they might transmit. So, how do I do that? Well, Tyvek, good sprays, other repellents, DEETs, permethrin-based sprays that will both, so we've got repellent, we've got insecticidal effect, depending on the spray or the ointment or whatever it is. So I'm a big fan of using, the appropriate repellents and so-called bug sprays off, kind of a generic term we'd all use to, did you put your off on? Yeah, I put a lot of it on frequently, because I don't want to be bitten by a flea or a tick or even a fly or a mosquito for that matter. They're all transmitting stuff we don't want. So,
wow, lots of information. Is there a most tying it into airports? Is there a most likely disease that someone might be exposed to, dealing with dead bird remains, like after a snark or after a bird strike, or handling the snarge? I know we need to take those general precautions, but is there,
Yeah, I'd be concerned. It's a good question, Cody. I think I'd probably be mostly concerned about influenza or perhaps some of the fungal diseases. A great example is, let's say, you've got to clean a bunch of pigeon or starling nests out of a hangar. Mm-hmm. That would be those are great areas. All the guano and the unsanitary conditions of a roost area, nesting area for pigeons, colony nesting birds, or starlings in their nests. High risk of some of the fungal pathogens, things like Cryptococcus, perhaps histoplasmosis, blastomycosis. For instance, though, that would come to mind. Certainly influenza potentially, but again, I tell folks, my job is to know the A to Z. Your job is to just know they're out there and that you absolutely want to protect yourself and take that seriously. And you do that with the things we talk about: gloves, washing hands, eye protection, face mask, Tyvek suits, rubber boots, taking snarge seriously. Yeah, it's just, it's a couple of dead, bloody feathers, but hey, you don't know what the heck else they might be carrying. Microscopic bacteria, viruses, fungus. Take it seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And carcasses, living animals that we're trapping or, cornering and manhandling into a cage or something, whatever it is, you want to take it seriously. So.
I've heard some interesting stories of one person one ops guy that I ran into caught a raccoon with his bare hands and put it into a garbage can to get rid of it. And then one thing that I see very often is bird nests in the jet bridges.
Mm-hmm.
Jet bridges are nearly impossible to keep birds out of. So it's not really the airport's fault because they're constantly going in there. But I've had reports where young birds have fallen in the jet bridge, and then go and investigate in the whole top of the rotating part of the jet bridge, the joint there, or the pivot point is just full of nesting material. And then we've had starlings and building their nests in insulation and having a whole chunk of insulation fall down on the people working down below them. So I didn't really think of those ones, but yeah, definitely potential exposures there.
Well, yeah, and easily aerosolized or airborne debris, the dust, you think of that, the dried nest material, all the dust from the excrement, all of these things, potential sources of infection, fungal, bacteria, virus, and even, parasites like insect type parasites, mites or ticks potentially in that nesting material. So yeah, just again, things to sort of think about. I always tell people, you don't have to be terrorized or terrified of these things, but awareness, right? So we talk about, I've worked with grizzly bears and mountain lions and wolves and black bears. You go into their habitat, not terrified, at least, not to be terrified, but aware, right? That, hey, there's things out here that could hurt me if I'm not on my game. And it adds to the experience, I think. And maybe somewhat the same story here, dealing with animals that potentially are carrying, very dangerous pathogens, right? I want to think that we can be careful enough to work with them, and that we are the professionals that should be doing that because we have that knowledge and that training, and we embrace that, and we take it seriously, and we protect ourselves and keep current with education like we're doing with this podcast, and try to keep informed, right? So yeah.
So now I'm starting to think of a career change.
You're going to become an accountant.
Yeah. But we're on almost an hour and 15 minutes now. I know there's so much more to talk about, and maybe we can have another podcast. But I usually ask this question towards the start to help learn more about the speaker. But I got a question for you, a little lighter of a topic. What's your favorite bird?
Ooh, I'm a raptor guy at heart, but so I love ferruginous hawks. I love gyr-falcons. But I will point out, I'll use this opportunity to brag a little bit. I've been involved for the last, 5 or 8 years with the National Aviary, searching for the supposedly extinct Ivory-Billed Woodpecker down in Louisiana. And we've actually rediscovered that species, that iconic species, also known as the Lord God bird, because it was so massive. This giant, woodpecker the size of a crow, second largest woodpecker ever known on Earth, next to the imperial woodpecker, which is extinct. And we've rediscovered this Lord God bird in the Louisiana swamp. So, and I had one sighting of one of those birds, and it was fleeting, but it was memorable. and no mistaking in my mind what it was. So I guess at this point, I'd have to say the ivory-billed woodpecker for me is my favorite bird. Yeah. Sorry, hawks and eagles and falcons and owls, but
You know what? When I was doing my internship, I got to handle a lot of songbirds and woodpeckers, and I had the opportunity to hold a pileated woodpecker, and that was just amazing. Um, to see that bird up close, and I couldn't imagine one that's even bigger and something with the bill of the ivory bill. But I do think that all woodpeckers have some brain damage because they just sit there in your hand and they're almost always pecking at something. So I can't imagine living a life like that. But that's a cool bird, and hopefully I'll get to see one someday.
well, and I'm pretty sure I saw this article that the woodpeckers have been studied or are being studied because of that, their ability to withstand the constant impact, right, of their brain. And so they're being used as a model to try to better understand traumatic encephalopathy in, for instance, military people and football players. It's like, how does this woodpecker, how is the anatomy and the cushioning that allows this bird to just constantly beat its head against the wall and not suffer brain damage, The other thing I like about them is they're stout birds. If you ever handle woodpeckers or flickers, right?
Yep.
They're really solid birds. I love that,
Cool. All right, one more lighthearted question. Give me, your some strange or interesting or unique experience you've had with wildlife. You've had experience with all kinds of wildlife and animals, or domestic and wildlife. But what's probably one of your most interesting experiences?
Oh, well, geez, I do. I feel very, very fortunate. I guess one that comes to mind real quick is I had the good fortune of working with the Forest Service in Montana on a couple of occasions and was called out as a wildlife veterinarian to implant radio transmitters in two different Wolverines. One was a young male and the other was a pregnant adult female. And to do that, we actually had to snowmobile high into the mountains. I mean, we're talking like 10,000 feet elevation, 8 to 10 feet of snow. I remember with particularly the pregnant female, was probably 10 below zero. And it was a surgical procedure I did in the field. And literally one of the assistants, the biological assistants, had a little handheld propane torch and was holding it over my hands as I was doing surgery to try to keep my hands warm at 10 or 12,000 feet. And what was also fascinating, that male Wolverine that I implanted, the trap that was used they were cubby traps, so they're like mini log cabins, really stout, and they have a trap door and some bait in there. When the Wolverine grabs the bait, the trap door slams shut. But that trap had been set and not triggered for like 2 or 3 consecutive winters. And that trapping crew, the biologist and his team, they were going up there literally like every day, checking that trap for 2 or 3 winters. And finally, one day, that young male Wolverine showed up. So you think of the effort that went into trying to catch that one animal and get it tagged. And Wolverines don't have much of a functional neck. I mean, they're like a, football player with, sloping shoulders and massive neck and head. And so you can't really put a traditional radio collar on them. So we discovered we could surgically implant into the abdominal cavity radio transmitters that would last for 6 or 8 months. And so that's what we had to do with them in lieu of radio collaring them. So anyway, that was real fortunate. I mean, that was one of my favorite animals. Black-footed ferrets are another favorite I have that I've gotten to work with. But those 2 experiences with living Wolverines were really memorable. And I treasure the times in the wild that I've actually seen Wolverine tracks, just 2 or 3, 4 times in the wild, because they are such elusive, rare animals. And they have really fascinating track patterns and paw prints. So, yeah.
That's cool. Very interesting. Excellent.
Thank you, Cody.
Yeah, no, I love doing these podcasts, and I learn every one that I do. I learn more, and I get the opportunity to talk to very knowledgeable and interesting people from across the world. And I just want to say I'm honored to have you as a guest tonight, and learn more about your background and specifically the diseases. But they creep me out a little bit. But I think that's probably a good good response, and something to keep in the back of everyone's mind, and how we need to use our PPE and treat every animal as it's a potential disease vector. And just we want to make sure we're getting that point across. We work in a unique field, and we're exposed to a lot of really interesting and exciting things, but there's also the dark side of it that we need to make sure we're prepared for and protect ourselves again. So
yeah, perfectly said, Cody. Yep, that's it. That's it in a nutshell right there. Again, love what we do, but just have the respect and the awareness of these possible problems that are out there, and protect ourselves, and everybody goes home at night and gets up the next morning. So yeah, very good.
I think we have some follow-ups to do in the future, but we'll call it a wrap tonight. I just want to thank you again for coming on, and it's been a great time, and look forward to the next time we talk.
Thank you. And Brad, thanks so much. Great to see you guys, and appreciate the chance to spend time with you.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Have a good night.
See you later.